Good evening. It is February 8th, and we are beginning our second class with Rabbi Moffic about the teachings of David Ellenson, Rabbi David Ellenson.
Rabbi Doctor.
Rabbi Dr. David Ellenson.
It's nice to see all of you. This is my first time using this technology. Actually, you know what? I used it once when I spoke at a church. They had something very similar, and it worked really nicely. So I'm glad we have this now. So the topic, so just to give everyone a little background, because I know a couple people weren't here last time. So the reason I chose this topic, well, it's a couple reasons. First, David Ellenson, for those who didn't know him, although at our last class, one of his Machatonim was here, which was really nice. David Ellenson was the president of Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Rabbinical Seminary. And he was an outstanding president and an outstanding scholar. And what made him so outstanding was, well, he was a scholar and he was kind. He was just an extraordinary man, but he had a deep knowledge of Jewish history, Jewish tradition, Jewish sociology. He was a Renaissance man in terms of Judaism. He grew up Orthodox, but he was absolutely committed to reform. And he had a broad understanding of traditional Jewish texts and modern Jewish life. And the reason we're talking about him is he died suddenly. It was very sad. He was only 76, and he was, and so I wanted to kind of try to keep his memory alive by sharing some of his teachings. Not only that, his teachings are very interesting and very relevant today. In fact, the topic I'm going to sort of touch on two topics today. If we get to the second one. The second one would be Israel, which we don't get to it, we're going to do it the next week, which is obviously very important. But the topic I wanted to talk about tonight, and one that he wrote a tremendous amount about, is Jewish denominations. It's Jewish denominations. Hey, yeah, I just started. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, I get I'm 41. I saw it when I was driving here like an hour and a half ago. I can't believe it's still, it was bad.
The one talking about the one.
South and north of Clinton.
The one I'm talking about, go run, pull down.
Yes, a truck.
Yeah.
Still.
Yeah, well, they cleared everything up, but it was.
Yeah, it was. North. It's like between Half Day and Old Elm.
Oh, that's
Right.
north.
Yeah. So anyways, Jewish denominationalism and Jewish unity. So let's start. One of the things that Ellenson studied was the 19th century. All the Jewish denominations today, you just, within 1 square mile of this building, you have conservative, reform, Reconstructionists, maybe 3 square miles. You want to go a little bit further out to Northbrook, you have Reconstructionists. But within just this small community, we have many Jewish denominations. But where did all these denominations come from? Is it, we're small enough people. There are only 13 million Jews in the world. Actually, it's almost 14 million. And yet we have all these multiple denominations who fight with one another, who have different approaches, different thinking. How did that happen? Well, the roots all lay in the 19th century. So in the 19th, and mainly in the 19th century in Germany. So why 19th century Germany? And this is what Ellenson studied. So what I'm going to be sharing is some of his research and his sort of approach so we can understand why we are the way we are today. So the beginning of the 19th century in Hamburg was the first Reformed synagogue. Now, the first Reformed synagogue came about mainly because Jews were starting to be allowed to go to secular universities. Certain professions which had been closed to Jews were now open, like being a professor at a school, going into law, going into medicine. These had been, Jews were essentially restricted in most of Europe to small communities we call ghettos. And over by the beginning of the 19th century, those ghetto walls were starting to fall. And Jews were beginning to integrate into the larger culture. And as they integrated into the larger culture, there was a sense that just as we are modernizing, so our religious faith has to modernize. And so the first thing that happened was that services began to be a little bit more formal. That if you go into even today, you go into a Chabad service or an ultra-Orthodox service, there's a lot of chaos. There's people some people praying, some people talking, there could be people drinking schnapps and it is an informal situation, people coming in and out. And beginning of the 19th century, they said, we need to bring more formality. And we need to have, instead of having the entire service in Hebrew and in Yiddish, we should have an edifying sermon in German. It was still the traditional service. It was still the same prayers that were said in Orthodox synagogues, but there was more decorum, more formality. This was the beginning of Reform Judaism. And it was mostly led by lay people. This was not rabbi-driven. And this is an important point in terms of sociology. One of the great things about David Ellenson is he was a sociologist. Sociologists aren't so interested in what people think, but they're more interested in what people do, how people are behaving. And the people who were behaving in this, bringing more formality, bringing German language, making the services a little bit more decorum. It was lay people, it was not rabbis. And that was the first Reform synagogue. By the way, the same thing was happening in America as well. However, in America, do you know what city the first Reform synagogue in America was in? Anybody know? Charleston, South Carolina. Yes. Charleston, South Carolina. So same thing. It was Charleston had the largest Jewish population in America in the 1820s. Yeah, it's astounding. It was, the American Jewish population at the time was very small. And that was before Jews immigrated from Germany in the 1840s. It was mostly Sephardic Jews who lived in America, and Charleston was the biggest, was the center. So that was the first, that was similar. It was more formality, more decorum. But then there was a tremendous shift. As Jews began to go to secular universities, the study of Judaism underwent a kind of revolution. So, and this was felt mainly, very powerfully, by students who had grown up Orthodox, and then they go to a secular university in Germany, and they start studying the Bible, and they start seeing that there are contradictions in the Bible. There are multiple stories. There are things that don't make any chronological sense. Abraham rode a camel, but camels weren't domesticated at the time. There was study of language. So there was all these things that we're seeing that the Torah, as we understood it, has a lot of problems on a very, if you study it as a traditional, a critical text, there are things that don't make sense. So this led to a kind of crisis of faith for many. And the crisis of faith led some to convert to Christianity. There were many, in fact, there were many Jews in mid-19th century Germany that converted to Christianity. We don't really talk about that very much, but the family of Felix Mendelssohn is a perfect example. Moses Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn's grandfather, was the most prominent Jew of 18th century Germany. But by the time it came, 5 out of his 6 children converted to Christianity. So Felix Mendelssohn was raised Christian, even though he had, a Jewish grandfather. So this was part of what led some people to convert to Christianity. And part of that was social too. People wanted to be accepted, but some of it was sort of a crisis of faith. But out of this crisis of faith emerged Reform and conservative Judaism as we understand it today. And in the 1840s, there was a series of conferences where these differences were hashed out. The first thing that was sort of announced was that Judaism is a religion as much as it is a people. And it is a religion that evolves over time. This is very important. The understanding that we can apply the tools of history to Judaism. Even today, if you are Orthodox, the idea that Judaism evolves and practices evolves, you don't say that. Basically, the idea is that there is an eternal continuity, that 2,000 years ago, our ancestors were dressing, praying, studying in the same way we are now. Maybe they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the tools, obviously, but they had the same practices. Reform and conservative began with the idea that no, we evolve, it changes depending on the time. that if more people speak German than speak Hebrew, then we can study text in German and we can translate. If at the time, the custom when you go indoors was to take off one's hat, then we can take off a hat and pray without a hat when we are in the synagogue. That there is a separation between customs and laws. That certain customs are bound by the time, but laws, things that are part of Judaism, they're eternal, and we keep those. But the customs we can discard. That's the beginning of Reform and Conservative Judaism. Then there's a split between those. So first you have the non-Orthodox split off from the Orthodox. And the key thing is called Wissenschaft des Judentums, which means the critical study of Judaism. And they came to the conclusion that Judaism evolves, Judaism changes. Then within this group, there is a division. Now, this is a hard question, so I don't know if maybe Todd might know the answer. But what was the initial source of the division between Reform, the emerging Reform Judaism, and the emerging Conservative Judaism? At the time, Conservative Judaism is known as called positive historical Judaism. But what's the first main difference? Anybody know? Todd?
Well, historically, at least, it was the serving shrimp at the conference.
Back in America in the 1880s, and that's true. But in Germany, in the 1840s and 1850s, it is the use of Hebrew, the use of Hebrew in the service. So the leader of the Reform group is a guy by the name of Abraham Geiger. Abraham Geiger is one of the great scholars of all Jewish life. He knew the Talmud, he knew the Hebrew Bible, he knew commentaries, all by heart. He was tremendous. And the main conservative leader was a guy named Zacharias Frankel. And they agreed on a lot of things, but they adamantly disagreed on the role of Hebrew in prayer. Abraham Geiger said, Hebrew was the language we spoke when we lived in the land of Israel. We no longer live in the land of Israel, so we do not need to speak Hebrew anymore. God hears our prayers in whatever language we use. So Geiger was of the opinion that virtually the entire worship service could be done in German. And even the Torah reading, you could have a couple lines of Hebrew, but it should be done in German so people understand what's going on. Zacharias Frankel said, Judaism evolved with the use of Hebrew. In every nation where we've lived, we've remained committed to the Hebrew language. Sure, we're going to speak German out in business and in the street. And yes, you can give a sermon in German, but the prayers have to remain in Hebrew. That Judaism is more than just a religion, it's a people. And that division, that split led to sort of the forming of what was called positive historical Judaism and liberal Judaism. Those are the names in Germany for Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism. Now, even within Reform, there were differences. There were many Reform rabbis in the 1840s and 1850s who not only wanted to do away with Hebrew, they also wanted to do away with circumcision, which is interesting, which is fascinating because that's come back again now. There's a whole but that group was relatively small and it didn't really exert that much influence. Change happens. There are periods where change happens pretty quickly, but there are certain things where change happens very slowly. So Reform and Conservative, by the 1870s, they have each started their own seminaries. So there's the Reform Jewish Seminary and there's the Conservative Jewish Seminary. And basically, students go back and forth between the two. They're not that different, except for the use of Hebrew. And we'll get to this in a few minutes when we get to America, but Conservative Judaism had a more openness to tradition. Reform was willing to excise certain customs. We're not only going to have no yarmulkes, but we're going to forbid people from wearing yarmulkes. In Conservative Judaism, you could wear one, you couldn't. Now, today in Conservative Judaism, everyone does, but it was a little more flexible with Jewish traditions. Now, where did Orthodoxy come from? And this is something very interesting, and this is something Ellenson wrote a lot about. So, when we think about Orthodoxy Orthodox Judaism sees itself as a permanent state, that it is continuing the tradition just as Jews have prayed for thousands of years. But what Ellenson points out as a sociologist is that that is absolutely not true. Orthodox Judaism evolves just as Reform Judaism evolves. In fact, Orthodoxy, as we understand it today, is very different than Orthodoxy that was practiced 100 years ago. 100 years ago in Germany and in America, you had Orthodox synagogues with no mechitza, no separation between men and women. Men and women, families sat together in an Orthodox synagogue. There is probably not one Orthodox synagogue today where that's true. So Orthodoxy has actually become more strict. The reason is there was a fear that if we accommodate anything in the modern culture, that will undermine our commitment to Judaism. So Orthodoxy evolves just as Reform and Conservative Judaism evolved, but it evolved without admitting it evolves. That was part of its approach. And so by the 1880s, you have the first Orthodox seminaries, and they're vastly different than the Reform and Conservative. Now, they do say we can have the sermon in German, but everything else basically has to be just like our ancestors were. That we are maintaining our commitment to Judaism. The only thing that has changed is that we live in the modern world. So we have professions. We may even go to a non-kosher restaurant, but we would eat vegetarian. Not that we're made, but you can go out and participate in the world. You're not stuck in the ghetto, but we will follow all Jewish traditions as our ancestors followed. So this is where modern Jewish denominations emerge. Now, what happens in Germany also happens in America, but in a slightly different way. Essentially, in Germany, the Reform and Conservative movements basically stay together. They have different seminaries, but the practices are similar, and graduates go back and forth. In America, we have a different situation, and that has to do with our history. So I said in the 1820s, Charleston was the biggest Jewish population, but in the 1840s and 1850s, about 40,000 Jews from Germany came to the United States. That's actually where all the oldest Reform synagogues like KAM and Hyde Park, they all trace back to that period of time of German Jewish immigrants in the 1840s and 1850s. And many of these immigrants were Reformed. They were already assimilating in Germany, but they weren't fully assimilating, but they wanted to preserve Judaism in America, so they built Reform synagogues. And those synagogues were similar to what was happening in Germany. And then, beginning in 1881, there was a tremendous migration of conservative Jews to America. Well, no, just Jews, traditional Jews from Eastern Europe. So between 1880 and 1920, 2.2 million Jews immigrated to the United States. So most American Jews trace their lineage back to that group. Mm-hmm. So, what happens with this group? All they come to is that there's these very formal, beautiful Reform synagogues in which English or German, some synagogues still kept their notes in German, even in the 1870s and 1880s. But these are Jews fresh off the shtetl. They've just left the shtetl and they came off at Ellis Island. They speak Yiddish. There's no way that Reform Judaism is going to appeal to this group coming from Eastern Europe. But at the same time, they're not really Orthodox. Most of them they maybe had some Orthodox background, but the truth is, Jews who left Europe in the 1880s and 1890s, they were the risk takers. They were the people that were sort of outsiders. Even though they were fleeing persecution, they tended to be they were often the younger sibling, They were people who did not want to follow in the father's footsteps and shopkeeper or farm or so forth. So these were already people that were unconventional. And so what happened was the leaders of Reform Judaism said, our type of Judaism is not going to appeal to newcomers who speak Yiddish and are used to more traditions. So we are going to build a seminary that will train American-born Orthodox rabbis, or American Orthodox rabbis, is something more important. And that's where the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the main school of the conservative movement, began. It was begun by Reform Jews. And so it initially was kind of a modern Orthodox seminary. There wasn't such a thing as conservative Judaism. It was Orthodox, but it was American Orthodox, in which English was spoken and so forth. But over time, it takes about 15, 20 years, a new denomination emerges called conservative Judaism. And the idea was that we will remain committed to Hebrew, to Jewish traditions and customs, to the entire Jewish people. So the conservative movement was Zionist before the Reform movement was Zionist. They said, we care about Jewish people everywhere, not just our religious life here. But we will also adapt to our new place. So we will speak English. We will have some prayers in English. We will not dress in the same manner. We will not wear a head covering when we are outside in the community. You know, so it was a kind of ethnic Judaism preserved in America. And that's where conservative Judaism came from. So by this time, let's put down 1920, that was sort of the end of the migration. You have, in America, you have Reform Judaism, which is kind of the biggest movement. You have conservative Judaism, which is growing tremendously. You have very little Orthodox. Orthodox Judaism doesn't really come to America until the 1920s. Now, why the 1920s? Well, there were some who had come before, but most Orthodox rabbis in Europe discouraged their flock from coming to America because America was seen as sort of a very secular, assimilating, crude place. You know, that in Europe there was an order. There were chief rabbis, there were communities, there was authority. America was kind of a free-for-all. And so many communities discouraged it. Now, some were forced to by pogroms and so forth. But in the 1920s, you have the establishment of Yeshiva University and the seminary at Yeshiva University called the Rabbi Isaac Ellenson said so. So what made this seminary Orthodox? What makes modern Orthodox different than conservative Reform? Two things. First is the idea that the Torah is the unmediated word of God. And so Reform and conservative Judaism would say Torah comes from God, but it comes from people inspired by God, that human beings wrote down the Torah with divine inspiration. Modern Orthodox says, no, the Torah is the literal word of God, and we're going to follow the Torah. And if we interpret it, we can try to understand what God was saying, but we're not going to edit it. We're not going to say that it was written down by human beings. That's one thing. The second thing is the idea that Jewish law is primary, that we don't change Jewish law. So in Jewish law, women don't lead prayer or read from the Torah. So within Orthodoxy, there is no female rabbi. Now, that's a new thing today, that there are something called Rabbi. We can talk about that. But in general, the idea is there are certain laws and practices. The law has superiority. The law has the last word. Whereas Reform and conservative Judaism would say, especially conservative Judaism would say, law has a vote, and it's a very important vote, but in certain cases, the law can be amended and adapted. Reform Judaism says, law has an influence. We should consult the law, but if we truly feel that the law is outdated and the spirit of the law is actually violated by the letter of the law, then we can get rid of it. So that's kind of what differentiates the movements. Questions so far? Covered a lot of ground. Anybody have any questions about the denominational differences so far?
Where does one find where law stops and custom starts? Is it in the Torah in one place? That's what I'm asking.
That's a great question. What's Torah, what's law, and what's custom? There is no clear dividing line. There is no. So I'll give you an example. You know, if you go to Israel and you're on an El Al flight and you sit down to someone, if you're a female and you sit down to someone who's Orthodox, they may request that you move seats because of something called shomer negia. They're not supposed to touch a woman that's not their wife. There is absolutely no law in the Torah that says you cannot touch a woman that is not your wife. That's not a law. That is a custom. Mechitza isn't really even a law. Mechitza, there is an idea in Judaism that's called building a fence around the Torah. And the idea is that we don't even want to be tempted or even come close to violating the law. So we build a fence so that we're not even close, so not touching a person of the opposite sex. Well, you know what could happen if you dance or you touch with someone of the opposite sex? It could lead to, sexual relations, and that's against the law. That's adultery. So in order to prevent that from even happening, you forbid touching. So that to me is a custom, but people would treat it as a law. And there's a lot of things like that. And there's a lot of differences. So for example, when I was a rabbi in Lafayette, Louisiana, that was fun. There was actually one Orthodox family in the community. And I went to their house for lunch one time, and it was a delightful lunch. And after about an hour, it was meat. We had meat. I can't remember what it was, but it was like some sandwiches, maybe roast beef, something. After about an hour, he served ice cream for dessert.
Yikes.
Yeah, no. We talked, he said, Rabbi, I know you're going to ask me about this because he's Orthodox. There is actually a whole debate in Jewish law. You're not supposed to mix milk and meat. We know that. So dairy and meat don't go together in one meal. But how long do you have to wait before you can eat? So if you eat a meat meal,
like your parents said you can't swim for 20 minutes.
how long do you have to wait? And that is actually a legitimate debate in the Talmud, and their answers range from 1 hour to 6 hours.
Yeah.
So technically, he was not violating any sort of law. Now, for other communities, the custom would have been to wait 3, 4, 6 hours. But in this, for him, it was 1 hour. So there's really very little, it's hard to distinguish between the two, because what is custom for one community may be treated as law for another community. Yeah. Scott, go ahead.
So in Germany in the 1840s, kind of the two leading figures were Samuel Holtheim and Abraham Geiger. What were kind of the differences between the two of those?
So when I talked about circumcision, banning circumcision, that was Holtheim. Samuel Holtheim was the first of what we call the radical reform rabbis. So these were the rabbis who essentially were willing to strip away almost all Jewish laws and customs. That even on Yom Kippur, the service would be 1 hour, and it would be, the Shema, a Torah reading, Kaddish, and a sermon. That's it. All the traditional liturgy, the Baruch Hu, the Michamocha, none of that. It would be almost a Unitarian service today, but with Jewish prayers. That was Holtheim. And no dietary laws. He was a radical reformer. And he also was probably the first rabbi to perform intermarriages. This was in the 1840s. So, I mean, this is a long time before they became common. So he was extremely influential, especially in Berlin. The Reform Synagogue of Berlin, he was the leader. And so he's considered the most radical of reformers. Now, his descendants were the two people who sort of took after him in America. One was named David Einhorn, and one was named Emil Hirsch. And they were actually brothers-in-law, I believe. I believe they married sisters. And in fact, the lineage is very impressive. Goes back, I'm sure some of you have heard of Edward Levy, the first Jewish Attorney General, president of the University of Chicago. You know, big deal.
And I think he is related to a Legacy Lakeside, Harry Lee.
Yes, he is. He is. I knew the whole thing. Yeah. So Edward Levy.
Wow.
Edward Levy is the grandson of Emil Hirsch. So, and of course, Emil Hirsch is the son-in-law, I believe, of Samuel Holtheim. I think they met. Yeah, can't remember the exact. I could be off. It could be cousin, but this sort of branch of the family were really tremendous American intellectuals. But they brought this radical reform message to America, and it actually expressed itself in a couple of ways. First, David Einhorn was the most prominent opponent of slavery in America, of the American rabbi. He had to flee Baltimore in the middle of the night because he gave an anti-slavery sermon right when the Civil War started. And Maryland was sort of one of those states that was right on the border. So David Einhorn sort of brought this social justice message to America. Emil Hirsch was also a social justice advocate, but he was somebody who believed in a very radical, pared down Reform Judaism. He called traditional Judaism, he called it kitchen Judaism. So he did not think very highly of the Orthodox. He said they're much more interested in what goes into your mouth than what comes out of you. You know, he's very critical. And what he did, he actually took the Torah scroll out of the sanctuary. In fact, this is a true story because I told you Emil Hirsch's grandson was Edward Levy, president, first Jew. Edward Levy's son is a very good friend of mine, but he's almost like a father figure. His name is John Levy. He's an attorney, and he's an incredible man. And anyways, he told me that Emil Hirsch donated the Torah scroll to the University of Chicago when it opened. So the Judaica Library at the University of Chicago was inaugurated by Emil Hirsch and included a donation of the Torah scroll that was in this, because he didn't read Torah. There was no Torah reading. It was mainly the Shema, a few prayers, and a sermon. That was the service. And that was a kind of radical Reform Judaism. Now, that existed in maybe a third of the Reformed Jewish congregation, a third of all Reformed congregations in the United States really didn't do any sort of Torah reading. Many of them would have a very brief Torah reading, in translation into English, and some were more radical than others. But what did happen is Reform Judaism kind of set itself up as an American Judaism, that it was English that was spoken. There was an American flag often on the bima, and there was a sense that we are in our new homeland, essentially. That's why the Reform movement was opposed to Zionism when it started. The Reform movement said, we are at home in America. If we start supporting a new state of Israel, people will accuse us of dual loyalties. It'll be like we were trying to serve two countries. America's our country. So this was the kind of radical Reform Judaism that sort of was promoted in America. Yes, Marilyn.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, the different denominations, including Zionism, would we say that, give it a term and call that Jewish pluralism?
The early Reform, that the ones that were Zion, call what pluralism?
All of the different denominations, would that be considered Jewish pluralism?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair description. Yeah, I think that's Jewish. Yeah, I think that's a fair way of saying it. from an Orthodox perspective, would not say it's Jewish pluralism. And here's where, and this is still true today. This is still true today, and it's sad, but essentially, Orthodox rabbis, not congregants often, but Orthodox rabbis in theology will view Reform and conservative Jews as Jews. So they're not going to say you're not Jewish because you're part of a Reform synagogue. Some people think that's what Orthodox believe. That's not true. Well, I mean, unless you're purely patrilineal, or unless you're, but they would say you're still Jewish. But Reform and conservative Judaism are not legitimate expressions of Judaism. So and this includes Jonathan Sacks, by the way. I mean, Jonathan Sacks was on an interpersonal level, he was very friendly with Reform rabbis and Reform Jews. But on a political, organizational level, there is an idea that we can't redefine what Judaism is. Judaism is a system of laws, and if we say that it's anything else, then we are distorting the meaning of Judaism. So I think from a Reform and conservative perspective, yes, the denominations reflect Jewish pluralism. But from an Orthodox perspective, the denominations really are not, they don't really exist. Yeah.
Thank you.
Listening to all of this, don't you think that culturally, if we don't make changes, we'll lose our religion? It's a very strong possibility because how culture has changed so tremendously. And you see with interfaith marriage, it's being more accepted now. If it isn't,
Right.
What's going to be, guys?
Right. I think that's a great question. And that kind of brings us up to today. One great quote from David Ellenson, I might not get the exact quote right, but this speaks to its sense of culture. American Jews growing up today, unless you're ultra-Orthodox, most American Jewish kids will know who Michael Jordan is, but they will not know who Rabbi Akiva is. Okay, so we are much more familiar with the central figures of American culture than we are with Jewish culture. That Judaism is not something that is front and center. It's a part of our lives, and people feel a connection, but it's not the predominant culture. This is different than when it was even 100 years ago. Even 100 years ago, people who, especially if your parents were immigrants, which, there are still people alive whose parents were part of the immigrant generation. If you grew up in the shadow of the Great Immigration, there was a sense that being Jewish was the fundamental sense of self, that it is who we are. And it kind of predominates over everything else. Yeah, we might have a job as a lawyer or a doctor, but being Jewish, that is not true for many people today. And that is an issue. And that actually kind of, one of the things that David Ellenson studied was how this happened. How did Judaism evolve from where it was in the 1920s, we have these three denominations, to where it is today, where actually the denominations are becoming less and less important. You heard it here first. I think within 30 years, Reform and Conservative will essentially be one movement. It may be even one school. I could see that happen. If it's not formally one school, there could be a tremendous amount of cooperation. That if someone who's going to Hebrew Union College could take classes at Jewish Theological Seminary and vice versa. It's already starting to happen. I mean, it's actually already starting, but I think it'll become even more full. Because essentially, as a sociologist, what Ellenson discovered, and this is what culture often exerts a far greater effect on religious expression than history and tradition. That, especially American culture. One of the things about Judaism is that Jews have almost always been separate from the mainstream, essentially outsiders throughout history, going back to Egypt. Jews were a different group within Egypt. And then in the Roman Empire, the Jews were essentially their own country, as long as they paid their taxes. And even for medieval Europe, was all about Christianity. The Pope was the most powerful figure in Europe. The bishops were the most powerful figure in local towns. And Jews were outsiders. They were different. Jews have always been different. In America, Jews maybe were different until 1960s, maybe. Jews were different. They were Jewish neighborhood. I mean, you couldn't buy a house in Kenilworth or Lake Forest, and Jews were, although Jews were not outsiders in the same way they were in Europe, Jews were still somewhat outsiders. That there was a lot of novels. Because Vanessa, you teach a short story, right? There are a lot of the great Jewish novelists of the mid-20th century, Philip Roth, Henry Roth, Saul Bellow, wrote about that tension between being insiders and outsiders. Jews are insiders in that they are professors at universities, are successful and so forth, but are outsiders in that they're not totally integrated with America. That barrier has basically been broken and gone. Jews are fully insiders. Now there is a rise in anti-Semitism right now, so that is something that has shifted the tide a little bit. But even so, it's not as if anti-Semitism is mainstream. It's not as if a mainstream speaker could go up and say, Jews killed Jesus. That many pastors would say that publicly or on the radio or on television 50 years ago. You couldn't really do that to them. They're fringe. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Of course it happens, but it's not part of the mainstream. And even so, I mean, just to think about this for a second. Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump all have Jewish sons-in-laws. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty, because I think it's Biden's daughter is married to somebody. So that that's right. The vice president's right. That's right. Although their child doesn't identify as Jewish at all, unfortunately. People tried to sort of get her to affirm Jewish identity. She has no interest. That's actually a perfect example that the child is very different than the father. But anyways, that indicates a kind of means that Jews are not really outsiders anymore. Yeah.
I spent the whole afternoon in the philosophy course, and today, for 2 hours, we discussed how we are very strongly.
Tell me. So what in
Right now, anti-Semitism appears.
Yeah.
Is a key word here, of being brought to the surface. It was hidden. It was always there. And we're a small percentage of the populace in America. And yet, isn't it interesting that so much of what is accomplished today is done in science and in many other areas by the Jewish populace?
Right.
And so there was a lot of arguing today and a lot of bringing out all the conflictual aspects of this entire situation.
That's a great comment, because I think it is that there is definitely tension around this.
And there always has been.
There always has been. And part of that tension is the fact that if we are not outsiders, will we survive? This is the fear. I mean, Jews are such a small percentage. This doesn't happen much anymore. This is very interesting. I've done interfaith weddings my whole career. I've been a rabbi now almost 18, 19 years. In the beginning, I used to have a lot of more tension. Sometimes parents would be, they would tell me, Rabbi, please make sure if it was co-officiated that the priest or the pastor doesn't say the word Jesus, because it'll upset everybody. And, or even I would get parents just tremendous. It still happens even once in a while. But it actually, I have witnessed it really become much, much less of an issue. And I see this as a positive. Because many families now have Jewish members of their family. And there is a sense, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, if you were Jewish and married somebody not Jewish, you were essentially leaving Jewish life. You were essentially assimilated. That's not the case anymore. People join synagogues, they have Jew, I mean, so in many, forget how I got on this team. But, so this is sort of the insider outsider. In many ways, we're insiders. But then, here's another important thing. America is inherently a diverse country. We are much, much less homogeneous than Germany, or even Canada. We are much, much more diverse than pretty much any country on earth. So we have an establishment. I mean, every president has been, until Obama, but were white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, except Kennedy and Obama. But we have had an establishment. But it is we are so much more diverse. So in some ways, everybody's an outsider. That's a beautiful thing about America. If you look at it in a very positive way, we're all outsiders and different. And that's where some of the tension today between, the white supremacists, they want to say Americanism is whiteness. And that is, but that never has been. Now, of course, there has been racism. That's not saying there isn't racism, but the idea that we have a primary identity in America has never really been this. Even look at the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't even mention the word God. So part of this is something that Ellenson talks about a lot. The movements changed, really starting in the 1950s and 1960s. The movements began to become more diverse themselves. So here in Chicago, for a long time, there was something called the Covenant Club and the Standard Club. Yeah, Covenant Club's closed. Covenant Club was the rich Eastern European Jews, and the Standard Club was the rich German Jews.
Is the Standard Club?
No,
Standard
Club is in
You're right. You're
They're
right.
all
One
gone.
of my things.
They're all
When
gone.
I was in the city, it was there, and I used to have lunch there all the time. And I miss it. Yeah, but Standard Club was wonderful.
That's it.
Yes, it was wonderful. But anyways, yeah. So that reflected this dynamic, the same dynamic of Reform and conservative Judaism. But after World War II, those divisions begin to fray. And one of the reasons they fray is intermarriage. People whose parents are from Eastern Europe and people whose parents are from Germany begin to marry one another. Whereas they had basically at one time been in their own groups, in their own social clubs, in their own synagogues. Now they're much more intermingling. Everybody's going to the university and meeting one another. And Eastern European Jews succeeded. They became, they sort of worked their way up in American life. And so there was less social class difference. And so a lot of those traditional differences fell away. And so Reform Judaism began to get many new members who had not grown up with them. And so then Reform Judaism begins to change and become more traditional. So if you visited, even if you visited North Shore Congregation, Solel wasn't around in the 30s, 40s. So if you went to North Shore Congregation Israel, it would have a very different feel than it does today. Virtually any congregation.
It's where Shalom is.
Right.
North Shore Congregation Israel started in the building that Shalom's in. It was much smaller. I mean, they still have the same stained glass windows. I frankly think the same seats. And it, so it wasn't that big thing on the lake.
Right. So that's in many ways a sign of affluence as well. So that's a whole nother area. Yeah. Because Jews have succeeded in America. I mean, it's a tremendous. This is actually a story Ellenson actually writes about in one of his essays. When Isaac Mayer Wise, I'm going back to the 1870s. When Isaac Mayer Wise was the rabbi of the Reformed synagogue in Cincinnati, when they built the synagogue, he wanted it to be right across the street from the main Catholic cathedral in town. And Cincinnati is a Catholic city. And he wanted it to be just as grand and just as big and ostentatious and beautiful as the Catholic Church. And it was. That's Plum Street Temple, which is in Cincinnati today. So part of Jewish life in America is we are on equal footing with other religions. Now, hasn't always been the case. but that was part of the hope and the aspiration. That would never happen in Germany in the 19th century. Over time, there were some synagogues that were built that were very nice, but there are no Jewish cathedrals in Germany. You see these beautiful cathedrals in England and France and Germany. There's no synagogue like that. There are some beautiful, like there's the beautiful synagogue in Budapest, the Grand Synagogue, but very few. Whereas in America, we have many cathedral synagogues. KAM, Sholem, so this was a different ethic in America. But what happens in the 50s and 60s is you begin to get a sense that the kind of formality, the kind of decorum that characterized Reform Judaism no longer fits the culture. Cultures change. So American culture in the 60s got less formal. Used to be rabbis wore, top coats and hats and so forth, and robes. Now some still do robes on the high holy days, I don't, but some do. But the culture changes. So as the culture changes, Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism change as well. And that's where a lot of the changes that have happened really have its roots in the 60s. Same with more Hebrew in services. Reform synagogues used to have very little Hebrew. But now we've become more comfortable with our own ethnicity. And by the way, this is actually, we can talk about this a little maybe even next week. Since October 7th, the terrorist attacks, there have actually been many more Jews who are openly, proudly identifying as Jewish. I was talking to a guy today, we had a coffee with one of our members. He was telling me his daughter, who is not religious at all, like she doesn't go to synagogue, even on the high holy days. I'm trying to change that, but she's a wonderful young lady. But she wears her Jewish star out, proudly. And she lives in Nashville. So, that's not a big Jewish population there. But so there is a sense, but that sense of Jewish pride comes with a reinforcement of ethnicity. That Jews became more comfortable being Jewish. And that part of that was same as the civil rights movement, where people were Black to pride in being Black, people were Latino to pride, this sort of ethnic consciousness that really began in the 1960s shapes Judaism as well. And that's also influenced by Israel as Israel becomes a prominent. So
Evie has, I unmuted you. Go ahead, Evie.
This progression, and I see, what you're saying about the blending of conservative and reform, almost becoming like Dati and low Dati in Israel in terms of, not quite as secular, hopefully. But I think in the 50s and the 60s, in that period, I think that there was more dissension within Judaism, having grown up at a conservative congregation with an Orthodox day school, hearing people at Anshe Yama talking about Saint Sholem on the lake and Saint Emmanuel in the lake. I mean, there was just that pinpointing back and forth. And if you're kind of in the middle there, it was kind of hard to know, where you did fit in or maybe didn't even try to fit in. So I think there's always been that dissension within Judaism, which when you try to explain to somebody who's of a different faith, it became very uncomfortable because we were not united in terms of our approach, as maybe somebody who might be a strict Catholic or maybe not so strict Catholic might have definite traditions or definite laws. And I think the melding was very confusing.
yes, you're absolutely right. Part of that is just human nature. The old joke about the desert island, the Jewish guy that's found on a desert island, and they rescue him, and there's 2 synagogues there. And they say, "My guy, why do you have 2 synagogues?" And that's the one I go to, and that's the one I never step foot in. So that's there is something, and we're a people of debate and argument, and so there's always been multiple voices. I think some of that still exists, but I think we're also in some ways, because the culture has become more secular, that in some ways just belonging to a synagogue is itself a sign of connection, and so there's more respect amongst the synagogue. know, we all have every synagogue has its own different culture, but there is not as much sort of putting down the practices of another synagogue, whereas that was more common back then. That also had to do, you know, they were still closer to the immigrant generation, in which people did have different practices, and there were very serious debates about those different practices. I mean, even the history of Lakeside, you know, if you read, you know, where Lakeside came from. Lakeside was begun with almost an anti-Zionist focus, you know, with the Society for Classical Reform, and that was a very ideological thing. Now nobody talks or thinks about that. That's nobody. That's meaningless today. You know, so
Council for American Judaism or something, and we had presidents there. It was a big deal.
it was a big deal back then, right? So these tensions that were very prominent 50 years ago, 60 years ago, as the culture changes, some of those issues become meaningless. Think about what today there are probably things that we get all up in arms about that we won't be 30 years from now. I mean, look, even 30 years ago, people were up in arms about gay rabbis, nobody cares. I mean, people are welcoming. I mean, I'm certain there are pockets that aren't, of course, there are always, but it's a different, certain issues over time become less prominent as we evolve and change. That, you know, that's to go back to Ellenson, since that's sort of the overarching theme, is that one of his great talents as a leader, and one of the things he taught me, is to see change, to understand how Judaism changes.
Mm-hmm.
That what works 10 years ago may not work exactly as it is today. And some of that's good and some of that's bad, you know? I mean, Vanessa, when you started as an educator, when Rabbi Ike was the rabbi educator at my synagogue in Milwaukee, we went to Hebrew school twice a week and on Sunday. Is that how it was? I can barely get people.
For Rollins that way, yes.
Right.
I would imagine a lot of people, you know, in the class remember all of that and all those hours, and then, you know, as it kind of went down and down, and then, you know, when we had COVID and we were tutoring one-on-one, we realized how valuable that is. I mean, you have to change. You have to change.
People didn't do mitzvah projects. I had a bar mitzvah, we didn't have a mitzvah project. Now kids have mitzvah projects, and they do great things, and what brings out the best? There was no birthright Israel. Now birthright, almost every kid does.
Right. Listen, in the Reform movement, there was no B'nai Mitzvah.
That's right.
And that's one thing, and they all stayed in through confirmation, and that was 16.
Yeah.
Maybe we should change that back.
Right. But Arnold Wolf said he didn't allow bar mitzvahs at Legacy Solel. He said it's too much bar and not enough mitzvah. I love that. So,
Wasn't that where confirmation came from?
well, yes.
If they weren't having bar mitzvahs, they were being confirmed.
I think confirmation was a direct steal from the Lutherans, that they wanted to be like their Christian neighbors, and they all had confirmation. And because it started, you know, 100 years ago.
I think that's accurate. And
I was first born.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, bar mitzvahs weren't, that is also something that has been shaped by culture. That the idea of a party, of really it being the driving force that brings families to synagogues, that wasn't true 50 years ago. So again, and I don't know if it'll be true 50 years from now. It may not be. You know, what brings people in could be very different. Mm-hmm. So that is part of, I think, what he brought to the study of Judaism. I think what we all try to live. So, well, thank you, everybody. This was great. It worked well over online. Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Yes, he is.
I tried.
So we did record this evening. If you want the recording, just drop me an email, and we'll see everybody this week.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Vanessa, for putting it online.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi. See you in Sarasota.
Bye.